right. This is the third lecture of Osher at Dartmouth's 2025 Summer Lecture Series. This year's theme is Preserving America's Four Freedoms, the heart of our democracy. My name is Susan McCaslin, and I'm the moderator for today's lecture. On behalf of Osher at Dartmouth, I would like to welcome the in-person attendees here in the Lebanon Opera House in Lebanon, New Hampshire. I would also like to welcome the members and non-members who are participating in this session via live stream. We welcome also our sister Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes at Brandeis University, at Towson University, at the University of Connecticut, at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, at the University of Michigan, at the University of Richmond, and the University of Rhode Island, and finally at the University of Virginia. A lot of work goes into producing and supporting each summer lecture series. We would like to thank the members of the 2025 Summer Lecture Series Committee, the dinner hosts, the volunteers working today, the Lebanon Opera House for hosting this year's Summer Lecture Series, the Lebanon Opera House technical staff, and Junction Arts and Media, JAM, for their live streaming technical help. And of course, the Osher at Dartmouth staff, and not least today's speaker, Professor Randall Balmer. A special thanks to the sponsors of this year's Summer Lecture Series for their financial support of these important lectures. Our platinum sponsor, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, our gold sponsors, Doyle and Lohman, Kendall at Harvard, and the Village, Kendall at Hanover, and the Village at White River Junction. Our silver sponsor, Legacy Counselors North, PLLC, DBA, Caldwell Law. And our bronze sponsor for today's lecture, Sheehy and Furlong and Beam, PC. Please give a hand to all the people and organizations that have made this event possible. Okay. And now a few rules of the road. For those in the live audience here at the Opera House, please mute your phones and note the locations of the emergency exits. There are exits to the left and right of the stage. For those in the Opera House today, please write any questions you have on index cards that you received when you arrived. For those online, please type your questions into the chat window on your screen. A question and answer period will take place following intermission. This should start at approximately 10:30. We will collect the index cards and gather them and chat questions during the first few minutes of intermission, about the first 10 minutes, at which point we will need to gather and organize them for the Q&A period. Please add, if you like, your first name and location to your question. There will be a post-lecture discussion following today's lecture. It will take place down the block at 1 Court Street in room 2C on the second floor. It's scheduled to last from 11:45 to 12:15. It is now my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Professor Randall Balmer. Professor Balmer is the John Phillips Professor in Religion at Dartmouth College. He is an award-winning historian, CNN contributor, and commentator on religion in North America. After earning his PhD from Princeton University, he taught at Columbia University for 27 years before coming to Dartmouth in 2012. He is the author of 18 books, including Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter. His book, Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right, emerged from a 2014 article he wrote for Politico entitled The Real Origins of the Religious Right. It demonstrated that the roots of the early religious right lay more in resisting desegregation than in banning abortion. It became one of Politico's most cited articles and permanently changed the public narrative. Wow. His book, Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, a journey into the evangelical subculture in America, now in its 5th edition, was made into an award-winning 3-part PBS documentary. Professor Balmer was nominated for an Emmy for writing and hosting the series. The American Academy of Religion in 2024 honored him with the Martin E. Marty Award for the public understanding of religion. Professor Balmer's articles appear in newspapers across the country. Faithful readers of the Valley News can find his work there regularly. His most recent article took the occasion of the Scopes monkey trial, the 100th anniversary of the Scopes monkey trial, to consider its long shadow over America's continuing conflicts between science and religion and modernism and fundamentalism. Professor Balmer's lecture today is America's Best Idea, the First Amendment and the Freedom of Religion. Please join me in welcoming Randall Balmer.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Susan. Thank you for that nice welcome, and I'm delighted to be here. As Susan was listing the names of universities who are tuning in, I think I've given a lecture at only one of them, the University of Richmond, so I'm happy to be present at these other places virtually. I want to talk today about what I think is America's best idea, and I want to apologize to Ken Burns. I admire him very much and his work. He claims that national parks are America's best idea, and I respectfully disagree. I think America's best idea is the First Amendment and the freedom of religion. So let me try to make my case to you in the next few minutes. First Amendment, just by way of background, was drafted by James Madison. It was ratified by Congress, approved by Congress, and then ratified by the states in 1791 as the First Amendment as part of the Bill of Rights to the American Constitution. The First Amendment reads, as you know, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. America's best idea, and I'm going to focus on the first part of the First Amendment in our conversation today. A bit of background for how the First Amendment came to be and what was the impetus behind the First Amendment. I think the first was the lessons of Europe and England. That is, the founders were very aware of what was happening back in the old world, and they wanted to avoid some of the carnage that had associated with the intersection of religion and the state. The French Wars of Religion from 1562 to 1598, Catholics pitted against the Huguenots, that is the French Protestants, and casualties, historians estimate somewhere between 2 and 4 million people were casualties of the wars of religion in France. In England, of course, you had the English Revolution, a contest between the Cavaliers or Royalists and the Parliamentarians or the Roundheads. Charles I, the king, was executed. The Puritans took matters into their own hands and committed regicide in the English Revolution, and about 200,000 casualties, 2.5% of the population. So the founders were very aware of what had happened in the old world, and they wanted to avoid those sorts of issues in the new world. James Madison said, reflecting on the old world in Memorial and Remonstrance, we'll come back to that later, torrents of blood have been spilt in the old world by vain attempts of the secular arm to extinguish religious discord by proscribing all difference in religious opinions. The second factor in the minds of the founders was the religious diversity in the colonies. When I teach my course on religion in North America, I have an exercise that I go through with the students, asking them to identify for me the colonial groups settling in the various colonies on the Atlantic seaboard during the colonial period. This is usually interactive. I won't do that today because we don't have that kind of setup. But we start with Massachusetts, and you had two major religious groups. We think of the Puritans, of course, being in New England, and that was an important component of Massachusetts, but you had the Pilgrims who came 10 years earlier. In 1620, the Puritans began coming in 1630, and these are two different religious groups already, even in Massachusetts. The Pilgrims had already separated out of the Church of England, whereas the Puritans considered themselves part of the Church of England and were trying to reform Massachusetts society to be a model, a city on the hill, as an example for England. Going down to Rhode Island, this is a haven of religious diversity founded by Roger Williams. I'll talk about Roger Williams quite a bit this morning. Roger Williams is also the founder of the Baptist tradition in America, but he also believed in liberty of conscience. Connecticut was another band of Puritans, New Haven Colony. Going down to New York, formerly New Netherland, founded by the Dutch Reformed, but it was also very open to other religious traditions. The Netherlands was the most tolerant society back in Europe, and that toleration transferred over to the New World. So in addition to Dutch Reform, you had Huguenots, again, French Protestants, you had Quakers, you had some Puritans, you had some Roman Catholics, you had Lutherans up in the Hudson Valley, a great deal of religious diversity, and in 1654, Jews coming to New Amsterdam from Recife as refugees. Heading down from that, New Jersey, three major religious groups. Again, the Dutch Reformed up in the Raritan Valley near New Brunswick, Quakers, and finally, Scots-Irish Presbyterians in Elizabeth, Perth Amboy, and then coming inland to Princeton. Pennsylvania, this is William Penn's holy experiment in religious toleration. Penn himself was a Quaker, but he opened it to other religious groups as well, and they flooded into Pennsylvania during the colonial period, including a lot of German groups, the Amish, the Mennonites, and my favorite group, the Schwenkfelders. And I'm happy to talk about the Schwenkfelders later if you want to talk about Schwenkfelders. But again, a lot of religious diversity in Pennsylvania. Delaware, Swedish Lutherans. Sweden tried to establish a trading entrepot in the New World, and so for a time you had Swedish Lutherans there in what the region we call Delaware today. Maryland is English Catholics, that is Catholics from England, although they were quickly overwhelmed by Puritans and other Protestants in colonial Maryland. Virginia was the Church of England. But by the middle of the 19th century, or the 18th century, pardon me, you had a lot of Baptists and other religious groups there in Virginia as well. And then the southern colonies, I'm going to kind of loop together, ostensibly Anglican, Church of England, but you also had a lot of folk religious practices, Moravians in South Carolina, for example, a portion of whom went up to Pennsylvania and settled in Bethlehem on Christmas Day. And then I'm going to add Florida, which is not part of the original colonies, to make the point that this is Spanish Catholics as opposed to English Catholics. The point of this exercise is to say, look at all this religious diversity in the colonial period. And we sometimes forget about this. And so as the founders were thinking about how to configure church and state in the New World, they had to account for this extraordinary religious diversity. If they were going to establish a religion in the colonies, which one would it be? New England probably would be happy with Congregationalism. Congregationalists are the lineal descendants of the Puritans. But the people in Virginia might not like that. Maybe Baptists should be the state church in the new nation. Yeah, Congregationalists wouldn't be happy with that. Other groups wouldn't be happy with that. And if Unitarians were the choice, nobody would have been happy with that. It just wouldn't have worked. So that is in the background, I think, for the First Amendment. So the founders decided to forge a different path. And that path was shown, I think, by Roger Williams, who I mentioned earlier, a graduate of Cambridge University, where a lot of the Puritans were educated back in England. He comes to Salem, Massachusetts in 1631, but he very quickly runs afoul of the Puritan authorities because he criticizes their desire to want to interleave church and state. And so he's convicted, he's hauled into court, convicted of diverse and dangerous new opinions, whereupon he is banished from the colony, and in the winter of 1635, 1636, he actually walks to what is now Rhode Island to find a religious refuge. And in 1639, he becomes the founder of the Baptist tradition in America. When he baptizes Ezekiel Holliman in the Musashonk River, going into the Narragansett Bay, and in turn baptizes Holliman and 10 others. That marks the beginning of the Baptist tradition in America. 1644, reflecting on his experience with Puritan Massachusetts and his further thinking about the configuration of church and state, he publishes a tract called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, in which he writes memorably, "When they have opened a gap in the hedge or a wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, God hath ever broke the wall, down the wall itself, removed the candlestick, and made his garden a wilderness, as at this day." I'm going to ask you to hold on to that metaphor and think about that as we go along here, and I'm going to return to that notion of the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. Another early example of religious toleration is the Flushing Remonstrance. This is Flushing, New York, at that time New Netherland, under the direction of Peter Stuyvesant, the Director General of the Dutch West India Company, and he wanted to suppress Quaker worship in Flushing, New York. And on December 17th, 1657, 30 protesters signed the Flushing Remonstrance in favor of religious toleration. None of the signers was a Quaker. They came to the defense of their fellow Quakers. The Flushing Remonstrance reads in part, "Our desire is not to offend one of his little ones in whatsoever form, name, or title he appears in, whether Presbyterian, Independent, Baptist, or Quaker, but shall be glad to see anything of God in any of them, desiring to do unto all men as we desire all men should do unto us, which is the true law of both church and state." Another example, William Livingston and King's College. I love this example. William Livingston was a graduate of Yale, and he wanted a college for New York. He looked north to New England and said, look, Massachusetts has Harvard, Connecticut has Yale. If New York is going to be a self-respecting colony of any worth, we have to have our own college too, and so we can compete with these neighbors to the north. In response, the New York Assembly initiated a lottery to raise funds for the establishment of a college in New York. Trinity Church, Trinity Episcopal Church, also Trinity Wall Street is how it's sometimes referred to, gave a valuable tract of land in the expectation that it, quote, would be a means of obtaining some privileges to the church. So the plans began to unfold. 10 trustees were appointed, 7 Anglicans, 2 Dutch Reformed, and Livingston, who considered himself a Presbyterian. Trinity Church all along insisted that the school president be Anglican, Church of England, and that official religious services use the Book of Common Prayer. And Livingston opposed this notion of using public funds for the support of a sectarian school. And he is adamant about this particular point. King's College was founded in 1754 with no public funds as an Anglican institution. As Susan indicated, I used to teach at Columbia. I sometimes told my students that King's College remained an Episcopal church or an Anglican institution for about 20 minutes before it secularized, but nevertheless. And in 1787, of course, they changed their name to Columbia College. It was no longer popular after the American Revolution to have an institution called King's College, so that's how King's College became Columbia. But the important point here in this illustration is that William Livingston's notion that public money should not support a religious school prevailed in the founding of Columbia University in 1754. James Madison in 1778 said, "Freedom arises from the multiplicity of sects which pervades America and which is the best and only security for religious liberty in any society. For where there is such a variety of sects, there cannot be a majority of any one sect to oppress and persecute the rest." A brief for multiculturalism and freedom of religion. As the founders were beginning to think more seriously about the configuration of church and state, one of the proposals in Virginia came from the governor, Patrick Henry, who proposed that, well, let's not designate any one particular group of Christians as the state religion. Let's apply a tax just generally for Christianity, for the support of the Christian religion. And the initial indications were that this was going to pass rather quickly within the Virginia Assembly, and James Madison nevertheless called for a pause. He wanted to be able to make his case that this was not a good idea. Even the designation of generic Christianity was not the way forward for Virginia, or by extension for the nation. And so he writes his famous treatise called Memorial and Remonstrance, which reads in part, "Because we hold it for a fundamental and undeniable truth that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. The religion, then, of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate." And this was successful. Madison's ideas prevailed, and the Henry proposing of him to support this or that teacher of his own religious persuasion is depriving him of the comfortable liberty of giving his contributions to the particular pastor whose morals he would make his pattern and whose powers he feels most persuasive to righteousness. And all of this culminates in the First Amendment, again drafted by James Madison, ratified by the states in 1791, the first amendment in the Bill of Rights. Again, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. America's best idea, in my judgment. All right, well, how is this going to work out? First Amendment, I think, was an experiment that was utterly unprecedented in Western culture. The idea of trying to construct a new nation, a new government, without the interlocking support of the church or religion was a new idea. It drew on Roger Williams and his notion of the wall of separation between church and state. It was also a concession to pluralism in the colonies that we talked about a little bit earlier, especially the example of the middle colonies. The most diverse religious colonies were New York, New Jersey, certainly Pennsylvania. Rhode Island was diverse as well. These were all examples of how religious pluralism could work, and the founders were well aware of this. The First Amendment also set up, I think, a free marketplace for religion. And this comes from Adam Smith. Adam Smith published a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776 as a brief for free market capitalism. When I was in college, my mentor in college talked about one of his graduate school colleagues coming in for his doctoral comprehensive examinations, and his friend was asked, "What's the most important thing that happened in 1776?" Whereupon the answer typically would be the Declaration of Independence, and the examiner said, "No, it was the publication of The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the brief for free market capitalism." But in that book, in The Wealth of Nations, which is a huge tome, Adam Smith uses religion as an example. If there's no state church, if there's no established religion, then religion will flourish in this free marketplace of ideas. And I would argue that religion in America amply proves his thesis. How did this play out in the states? The final two states to disestablish religion, that is, no longer to provide taxpayer support for religion, were Connecticut in 1818 and Massachusetts in 1833. In Connecticut, Lyman Beecher, who was a graduate of Yale and pastor of the Congregational Church in Litchfield, Connecticut, from 1810 to 1826, this is up in northwestern Connecticut, he was very fearful about this prospect of disestablishment in Connecticut. He opposed disestablishment because it would deprive the congregational churches of tax money, but he was also concerned about how it would affect morals in Connecticut. So he writes, "The minor sects had swollen and complained of having to get a certificate to pay their tax where they liked. Our efforts to enforce reformation of morals by law made us unpopular." Oops, sorry. It was a time of great depression and suffering. Pardon me. It was the worst attack I ever met in my life. So Lyman Beecher contemplated this notion of disestablishment in Connecticut as being just the most horrible thing that he could possibly imagine. Well, Connecticut did go ahead in 1818 by popular vote to disestablish the Congregational Church in Connecticut. And look what Lyman Beecher said 2 years later. The best thing that ever happened to the state of Connecticut. It cut the churches loose from dependence on state support. It threw them wholly on their own resources and on God. Revivals now began to pervade the state. There came such a time of revival as never before in the state. It worked. Well, if the First Amendment is America's best idea, what are the threats to the First Amendment? And there have been many throughout American history, and let's go through some of them at this moment. Beginning with the National Reform Association. The background is the Confederate Constitution. When the Confederacy broke away from the Union, they made a big point of pointing out that the United States Constitution, that is the Union Constitution, did not include any references to God or the United States as a Christian nation. And so the Confederates were very careful to write that kind of language into their Constitution, the Confederate Constitution. And this created a bit of a moral dilemma for many Protestants in the North. And so in 1864, the National Reform Association was founded with the support of many Protestant ministers, trying to amend the Constitution to include Christian language into the U.S. Constitution. The proposed amendment read like this: "We, the people of the United States, humbly acknowledging Almighty God as the source of all authority and power in civil government, the Lord Jesus Christ as the ruler among the nations, his revealed will as the supreme law of the land, in order to constitute a Christian government and in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility." The rest of that is the existing preamble to the Constitution, but you see the imposition of this Christian language at the front of this proposed amendment to the Constitution. The head of this movement was a man named William Strong, who was president of the National Reform Association, also a justice on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and in 1870 he was nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court by President Ulysses S. Grant. So this was not some kind of marginal organization. This was an organization that had a great deal of power and clout behind it. They took their proposal to the president, Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln temporized wisely and said, the work of amending the Constitution should not be done hastily. In other words, I'll get back to you on this. And fortunately, he never did. An attempt to amend the Constitution is the Christian Amendment movement, founded during the Cold War in Topeka, Kansas, later moved to Pittsburgh. They had their own newspaper, the Christian Patriot, and the proposed amendment read, "This nation devoutly recognizes the authority and law of Jesus Christ, Savior and ruler of the nations, through whom are bestowed the blessings of Almighty God." Members of Congress introduced this as early as 1947. A member of Congress from California, Presbyterian, said, "Our country is a Christian nation. If we are to survive against the evil forces of communism, we must put Christ into a proper perspective in our national life." And once again, this was not approved by Congress, but Congress moved in other directions during the Cold War, during the Eisenhower administration, putting under God into the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954 and adding or substituting "In God We Trust" for "E Pluribus Unum" as the national motto. Well, who are some of the contemporary Christian nationalists now who are trying to argue for America as a Christian nation? First, what is a Christian nation? I think, in my judgment, to be a Christian nationalist, you have to believe in two of the following three propositions. First, the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Second, the United States is a Christian nation. And finally, the United States should be a Christian nation. And I think if you believe two out of those three, you probably qualify as a Christian nationalist. So there's a lot of possible configurations here. Maybe not founded as a Christian nation, but it has become so and should remain so. The most common would be the United States was founded as a Christian nation, has somehow lost its moorings, and must return once again to being a Christian nation. And what does that look like? Again, there are many versions of this, many possibilities. No same-sex marriage for a lot of Christian nationalists would be one of the things that they would be shooting for. No abortion, no divorce. A lot of taxpayer support for religious schools. This is a big issue that's snowballing here in New Hampshire and elsewhere. And some of the Reconstructionists actually look for a radical rewriting of the civil and criminal code to comport with so-called biblical laws. They really love the book of Leviticus, by the way, but trying to revise the codes so they are consistent with biblical laws. The death penalty, for example, would apply to idolatry, homosexuality, adultery, witchcraft, blasphemy, and even, in some cases, juvenile delinquency. Well, three examples of Christian nationalists who are trying to make this case. Let's begin with David Barton. David Barton is a graduate of Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1976, a degree in religious education. A youth pastor in Texas, and then founder of a group called Wall Builders, also in Texas, a very active organization. And you would think from the name of the organization, they're talking about the wall of separation. Silly you. They're talking about the walls of the temple, rebuilding the walls of the temple, as described in the Hebrew Bible. And for a good number of years, he was vice chair of the Texas Republican Party. David Barton published a book called The Jefferson Lies, Exposing the Myths You've Always Believed About Thomas Jefferson. A New York Times bestseller, arguing that the founders were Christian and that the United States is a Christian nation. It's riddled with fabrications, made-up quotations, other quotations wrenched out of context. So egregious are these errors that the very conservative publisher, Thomas Nelson Publishers in Nashville, Tennessee, withdrew this book from publication, even though it was on the New York Times bestseller list. It takes a lot for a publisher to do that. Nevertheless, Barton remains influential within the religious right. One of his acolytes is Newt Gingrich, but many others, including this current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Douglas Wilson, pastor of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, graduate of the University of Idaho, very much Calvinist in his theology. I can talk more about that later if you'd like. And an unabashed Christian nationalist. He's formed a congregation called Christ Church there in Idaho, which has kind of a large tentacular reach throughout that community, and has his own denomination, essentially the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. About 150 congregations across the country are affiliated with this guy, Doug Wilson. Here's one of his institutions, New St. Andrew's College in Moscow, Idaho. And they recently opened a branch of Christ Church in Washington, D.C. just this month, in July of 2025. And at the first gathering of this church, one of the people in the congregation was Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. Wilson wrote a book, or co-wrote a book called Southern Slavery as It Was. Antebellum slavery, he said, produced a genuine affection between the races that we believe we can say has never existed in any nation before the war or since. One could argue that the black family has never been stronger than it was under slavery. It was certainly stronger under the Southern slave system than it is today under our modern destructive welfare state. His agenda, he seeks an international federation of Christian nations, no abortion, no same-sex marriage, voting by households, that is, the male head of the household would vote for the entire household, amend the Constitution to include the Apostles' Creed, office holding only by Christians, and eliminate secularism entirely from society. So, Doug Wilson is the second of our three Christian nationalists. The third you probably heard of, Russell Vaught, now the Director of Office and Management of the Budget. Grew up in Trumbull, Connecticut, attended and graduated from Wheaton College. This is Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, an evangelical institution, and took his law degree at GW University in Washington, D.C. He worked for various organizations and individuals, including the Heritage Foundation, the House Republican Conference, and was a legislative assistant for Senator Phil Gramm from Texas. Donald Trump named him Deputy Director of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, in 2018, and then he became Director from 2020 to 2021. After Trump was defeated, I believe Trump was defeated, yeah. He started a new organization called the Center for Renewing America, based on the so-called big lie that Trump had won the election in 2020, and also wanting to combat critical race theory as part of its agenda. He is the chief author of Project 2025, as you probably know, and once Trump was reinstated in office for a second term, Vaught became, once again, Director of Office of Management and Budget, where he is today. What does he say? We talk about under God, we are a Christian nation. We were meant to be a Christian nation. We have lost that. That means, yes, we love religious liberty, but to the extent that we don't even have Christians that talk about how we're a Christian nation, something's wrong there. Western civilization does not work without the underpinnings of a Judeo-Christian worldview. Well, if these are the arguments being advanced, how do you refute the Christian nationalists? And let me give a stab at it here. Three counter-arguments, I think, theological, historical, and I would argue practical. Let's start with theological. From John 18:36, quoting Jesus, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. Let's go home." I'd pretty much seals the deal, seems to me. But there's more. I was actually preaching on this text a few weeks ago, and I noticed this verse between two very prominent stories in the Gospel of John. One is the feeding of the 5,000, and the next is Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee. But in between that, there's a single verse that reads, "When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone." Jesus had no aspirations to being king. Mark 12:17, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And we could have a long discussion about what that means theologically, but at least it suggests to me that there are two different realms. There's Caesar's realm and there's God's realm, according to Jesus himself in the New Testament. The historical counter-argument to Christian nationalism, I think, is a little bit longer, and we'll spend a bit more time on it. But let's begin with the founders. David Barton claims that 53 out of the 55 founders were evangelical Christians, which is so ludicrous it hardly bears addressing, but nevertheless, let's do that. They were not Christian in any orthodox sense of the term, let alone evangelical Christians. Most of them, of course, were deists. As I'm sure you know, a deist is somebody who believes that there is a God, but this is a God who is disinterested in the workings of the world and of humanity. The analogy is to a watchmaker who winds the watch and lets it run down unimpeded by any intervention. Let's just take a couple of quotes here just for fun. Benjamin Franklin, I love this quote, particularly the last part of this quote. He was asked about his views on religion, and I should point out that the founders did understand the importance of religion, and particularly Christianity, for morality in the new nation, maintaining morals. But to say that they are therefore evangelical Christians is a huge leap, as you'll see here. Franklin writes, "As to Jesus of Nazareth, my opinion of whom you particularly desire, I think his system of morals and his religion, as he left them to us, the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. But I apprehend it has received various corrupting changes, and I have, with most of the present dissenters in England, some doubts as to his divinity. Though it is a question I do not dogmatize upon, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble." The inimitable Benjamin Franklin. John Adams, writing to his son, John Quincy Adams. And again, David Barton wants to portray John Adams as an Orthodox evangelical Christian. "An incarnate God, an eternal, self-existent, omnipresent, omniscient author of this stupendous universe, suffering on a cross, my soul starts with horror at the idea, and it has stupefied the Christian world. It has been the source of almost all the corruptions of Christianity." Thomas Jefferson, again, hardly an evangelical Christian. One of his projects during his life was to literally excise from the New Testament all references to Jesus as divinity, all references to miracles from the New Testament. And this was published posthumously as what we know today as the Jefferson Bible. So Jefferson was trying to underscore the fact that, yes, Jesus was a good moral example, probably the best ever, but not divine, as Orthodox Christianity would hold. He writes, "To the corruptions of Christianity I am indeed opposed, but not to the genuine precepts of Jesus himself. I am a Christian in the only sense he wished anyone to be, sincerely attached to his doctrines in preference to all others, ascribing to himself every human excellence and believing he never claimed any other." So, possible exceptions to this notion that the founders were not evangelical Christians. John Witherspoon was a Presbyterian minister, president of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. If you stretched a little bit, maybe. Benjamin Rush was a physician, but I'd like to say that with the possible exception of these two founders, none of the people responsible for the formation of this country would be welcome as members in any of the churches now advocating for Christian nationalism. So, a second bit of historical evidence has to do with how the founders themselves understood the First Amendment, how they interpreted it. One of David Barton's refrains is that the Constitution does not include the phrase separation of church and state. I'll give him that one. He's right. He's absolutely right about that. The Constitution does not include the phrase separation of church and state. Maybe the only true thing he's said in a long time. But it's fair to ask, how did the founders understand the First Amendment? What was their interpretation of it? And the context here is that after Jefferson was elected president in 1800, a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut wrote a letter to him asking for his understanding of the relationship between church and state. And on New Year's Day, 1802, Thomas Jefferson sat down in the White House and wrote a response to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, end quote, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Further evidence, the Treaty of Tripoli was negotiated at the end of George Washington's term as president, sent to Congress by John Adams with his endorsement, and read before the U.S. Senate and ratified unanimously on June 7th, 1797. Ratified unanimously by the U.S. Senate. Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli reads, as the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the said states have never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Islamic nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the countries. Again, the relevant parts of the first part here, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. During Watergate, we talked about smoking guns. Here's my smoking gun. All right. The final argument against Christian nationalism, I would argue, is practical. That is, it works. The separation of church and state has worked remarkably well for over 200 years in our history. Both ways. It has shielded the government from religious factionalism, and it has protected the integrity of the faith. Thomas Jefferson himself observed this in 1808. We have solved by fair experiment the great and interesting question whether freedom of religion is compatible with order in government and obedience to the laws. And we've experienced the quiet as well as the comfort which results from leaving everyone to profess freely and openly those principles of religion which are the inductions of his own reason and the serious convictions of his own inquiries. In the 19th century, James Bryce, a historian at Oxford University, observing what was happening in the United States, wrote, half the wars of Europe, half the troubles that have vexed European states, he wrote in 1893, have arisen from theological differences or from the rival claims of church and state. This whole vast chapter of debate and strife has remained virtually unopened in the United States. Now I want to come back to Roger Williams and the garden. If you remember the metaphor that I quoted from the Bloody Tenet of Persecution, written in 1644, Roger Williams talked about the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, how it needed to be separated by this wall of separation between the two, the church and the world. I think we in the 21st century miss the power of that metaphor. That is to say, when Roger Williams is talking about the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, Williams and his contemporaries were not members of the Sierra Club. That is to say, They didn't share our romantic notions about wilderness. So for them, wilderness was a place of darkness where evil lurked. And so when Roger Williams is talking about protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, his primary concern was protecting the integrity of the faith from too close an association with the state. Let me give you an example. Some of you will remember in July of 2001, the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, Roy Moore, plopped a 2.5-ton granite monument in the lobby of the Judicial Building in Montgomery, Alabama. At some point, people pointed out the size of a washing machine. And it was emblazoned with the 10 Commandments. This became known as the Alabama 10 Commandments case because it was challenged in the courts. Challenged especially because Roy Moore ruled that no other religious representations be allowed in that place, just the 10 Commandments. So he rejected, for example, a petition from the Alabama Humanist Association, both members perhaps, said, no, we're not going to do that, just the 10 Commandments. Well, the placing of that monument was challenged in the courts. I happen to be one of the expert witnesses in that case in Alabama, and my testimony was essentially what I've given you today. That is, the First Amendment has created this free marketplace for religion, which means that religion has flourished precisely because of the separation of church and state, precisely because of disestablishment. When Judge Thompson ruled correctly that the 10 Commandments monument, also known as Roy's Rock, violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment and ordered its removal, one of the protesters screamed, "Get your hands off my God." Unless I miss my guess, one of those commandments says something about graven images. And that was precisely Roger Williams' point. Protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. Protecting the faith from being trivialized or fetishized by too close an association with the state. Where are we in America because of the First Amendment, because of this free marketplace for religion? We're off the charts in terms of the Western world in our religiosity. Religion flourishes here as nowhere else, I think, precisely because of the First Amendment, America's best idea. And to extend the economic metaphor, religious entrepreneurs are constantly in this realm, competing with one another for popular opinions. Mother Ann Lee and the Shakers, Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science, Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, Joel Osteen down in Houston, Texas. They are keeping this religious marketplace alive and vibrant and vital, precisely because the state has no role to play in this free marketplace for religion. Well, the Christian nationalists are not giving up. They've adopted new strategies, I think, in recent years, several approaches. They're kind of shying away from doing formal amendments to the Constitution, working instead in incremental ways through legislation and through judicial rulings, especially in states with Republican supermajorities, Iowa, Florida, and Oklahoma. These are all battlegrounds for this separation of church and state. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has been part of this as well. I like to say I wish the Supreme Court had half as much deference to the First Amendment as it does to the Second Amendment. The Espinoza decision in 2020, the Bremerton decision, the football coach praying on the 50-yard line. Jesus said, pray in your closet. I don't recall Jesus saying, pray on the 50-yard line. Maybe I missed that. Carson v. Macon in Maine, all of those are whittling away at this wall of separation between church and state. And they're particularly attacking what I call a bright line. This has always been the case in American history, this bright line on funding for religious education. Going back to the 19th century, James Blaine from Maine was Speaker of the House of Representatives and also the Democratic nominee for president in, I believe, 1884. Don't quote me on that. I don't have that in my head right now. He proposed an amendment to Congress that would forbid using any taxpayer money to support religious education. It did not pass the Congress, but 37 states adopted some form of the Blaine amendments that forbade the use of taxpayer money in support of religious education. The school voucher movement is, of course, an attempt to undermine that, to provide taxpayer money to support religious education at church schools. Another tactic is simply to bluster along and say, no, the First Amendment does not call for the separation of church and state, repeating the falsehood that the United States is and always should be a Christian nation, and a lot of people on the religious right and many politicians are adopting this strategy as well. One final note. This is from Sandra Day O'Connor, who, as you know, was appointed to the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan. And in her final decision on matters of church and state, she wrote the following: "Those who would renegotiate the boundaries between church and state must answer a difficult question. Why would we trade a system that has served us so well for one that has served others so poorly?" So, separation of church and state, I think, has ensured political stability. It has also engendered a lively, salubrious religious culture. And in my judgment, the only intersection of church and state is right here, actually. And anyone know where this is? Salem, Oregon, just a few blocks from the state capitol, where State Street intersects with Church Street. And in my judgment, we should keep it that way. Thank you very much.
Okay, we are about to begin a brief intermission, and it will go for about 25 minutes. So please, in addition to getting coffee and something to eat, fill out those index cards with your questions and the chat window online. And you can drop those cards in the basket right here. There are also some pens. And so we will be collecting those in about 10 minutes. So that we can organize the question and answer period. So we will see you back here at about 10:25. Thanks a lot. Okay, welcome back. We have a lot of questions. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to all of them, and we've tried to group them a bit to, to make sure we cover as much of the waterfront as possible. We're going to begin with a pretty simple question, which is, how do you define evangelical?
Yeah, I have a three-part definition. Trinitarian, by the way. An evangelical is somebody who takes the Bible seriously as God's revelation to humanity. And so she or he would be inclined to read and interpret it literally. Although I usually point out that evangelicals, like other believers, tend to engage in what I call the ruse of selective literalism when they approach the Bible. So as I suggested earlier, Leviticus tends to be a big book for a lot of the Christian nationalists, but people tend to focus on different parts of the Bible. But nevertheless, the idea of taking the Bible very seriously as God's revelation to humanity. The second is an evangelical is somebody who believes in the centrality of a conversion or born-again experience. And this comes from the 3rd chapter of St. John in the New Testament, when Nicodemus, a Jewish leader, visits Jesus by night and asks how he, Nicodemus, can enter the kingdom of God. And Jesus replies, "You must be born again," or in some translations, born from above. And evangelicals have kind of fixated on that as a moment, very often a dateable moment, when they turn away from their past and embrace salvation or redemption. And they talk about that. They will be able to discuss the circumstances surrounding that conversion. And the third characteristic is an evangelical takes seriously the mandate to evangelize, to bring others into the faith. Although, again, I like to point out that they tend to hire professionals to do it for them. So you have missionaries, and these big mega churches have outreach pastors or evangelism ministers and things like that. But those would be the three characteristics. And then in response to one of the other questions that came up, someone asked about the evangelical interest in Israel. And that's a lecture in itself, but I'll try to make it quick. Evangelicals, again, because they take the Bible very seriously and want to interpret it for themselves, have tended to fixate on a lot of the apocalyptic writings in the Bible. So particularly the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible and the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament. And if you've read those books, they're very difficult to navigate, but the general understanding is that these are prophetic books. That is, they will tell us what's going to happen as we approach the end of time. So it's based on a linear view of history. History is about to come to some sort of a cataclysmic end, as described in the book of Revelation and to some degree in the book of Daniel. And the corollary to that is that Israel occupies a special place in the divine economy. And so that's why you have a lot of these pro-Israel evangelicals. I like to say that evangelicals are simultaneously pro-Israel and anti-Semitic.
Go figure.
Pro-Israel in that it's, the state of Israel, right or wrong sort of mentality. I'm exaggerating that a bit, but it is present. Anti-Semitic from a Jewish perspective, because they are looking ultimately for the conversion of Jews to Christianity. So that's why I say it's pro-Israel and anti-Semitic.
Got it. Okay. One person writes that, having done such an excellent job of articulating the case for the separation of church and state, noting that there are places within our public documents about eliminating in the Pledge of Allegiance under God or on our coinage, in God we trust. Should we try and get God out of there?
That's a great question. I think that is an example of what Roger Williams was talking about with fetishization of the faith. I remember a few years ago, this is back when I was teaching at Columbia, and one of my colleagues, Alan Brinkley, who at that time was provost at Columbia, was on one of these cable shows where they shouted at one another, Crossfire or something. Is that right? Crossfire, maybe? And he was asked that question. Should we take "In God We Trust" off of our money? And his response was, I think, very telling. He says, come on, nobody pays attention to that. And it's true, right? I mean, talk about fetishization and trivialization. Here you have a religious sentiment. I mean, it's not a very good religious sentiment, but it's a religious sentiment that is so ubiquitous that we just don't notice it. And so I would say, if I'm going to expend my energies on some issue, that's probably not the one.
Amen. Okay. This is from Erica from our live stream audience. This is also echoed by Marion from our live stream audience. They were struck by the slide that showed that in relation to other countries, the United States is vastly more religious, like over 70%. And their question is that they thought the percentage of people in organized religion is actually dropping in the United States.
Yeah, it is. And I have to, a lot of people have suggested reasons for this, and I think one of the reasons is that you have this kind of crass politicization of religion in America that has turned people off. And certainly within evangelicalism, I see that. A lot of people are just moving away from it, moving to nothing at all, or moving toward a different religious expression because they're just kind of fed up with that. And again, that's back to Roger Williams' point, again, I think, about trying to protect the faith from that sort of corrosive influence. So yes, religious adherence is down, but still we're way above other Western nations, even with that.
Yeah.
The rise of the so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, has been tracked over the past decade or more in American life.
And there's a generational difference there, isn't there?
There's a generational difference. And what happened, I talk about this in my classes quite a bit. It's very difficult to pass the faith from one generation to the next. And the Puritans faced that back in the 17th century. You had this founding generation of Puritans who came over, left everything behind in the old world, made this very perilous Atlantic crossing to carve a godly commonwealth out of the howling wilderness of Massachusetts. And when it came time for their children to step up in front of the meeting house and give an account of their own religious pilgrimage, how could their stories in any way compare with that of their parents? And so you had this massive falling away from the faith that was addressed by the Puritans in something called the Halfway Covenant in 1662. But nevertheless, you had that generational fall off because, again, it's very difficult to pass the faith. Another great example of that is Chaim Potok's wonderful novel, The Chosen, about Danny Saunders, who is the son of a Rebbe in a Hasidic Jewish congregation, which emphasizes the warm-hearted piety and so forth. And Danny Saunders has all of the intellectual gifts that his father could hope for, so that Danny, could someday take his father's place as head of this congregation. But he can't summon the piety to do it. Very, very difficult to do that. So that's a factor. I think the politicization is a factor. I think modern life is a factor. Two-income households, we come to the end of the week, you're exhausted, right? The last thing you want to do is pack up the kids and head off to church.
And dress them up.
Dress them up, yeah. Well, nobody dresses up anymore, but but yeah, that's a factor as well. So, we have. I think the religious right is correct in saying that the society is secularizing. Yes, that's probably true. So those sorts of 1950s expressions of faith and religion are simply not part of the culture in the same way they were decades ago. Yeah. Which is one of the things, in turn, that I think is driving the religious right, because they're saying we need to get back to that in some way. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
No, no. Well, and the religious pluralism and what that will do to religious affiliation.
Exactly, and that I think relates to one of the questions here. I think, well, I've talked about the rise of the religious right, and you know my argument on that, Susan, but aside from my central argument, which is that it was the defense of racial segregation, not opposition to abortion, that was the catalyst for the religious right. Aside from that, I think the two big catalysts for the religious right in the 1970s were a reaction to the countercultural movement, the sexual revolution and all of that. But also, I think Lyndon Johnson signing the Hart-Celler Act on Liberty Island in July of 1965 that did away with immigration quotas, which meant that over that long term, since then, over the decades, and I study this, so I've watched it, the religious landscape of North America has literally been transformed. I travel a good bit in North America, and I see Sikh gurdwaras and Buddhist stupas and Hindu temples and Shinto shrines in places I never would have imagined that. So the religious right is reacting to that as well. They see this as somehow threatening their religious hegemony in American society, and they want to try to claw it back.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a pretty specific question. Again, it comes from one of our live stream audience, Mary from the Ollie of the I'm going to guess U of M is University of Michigan. And it says, Texas just passed a law requiring posting of the 10 Commandments in all public schools. Speak to what we as citizens can do to preserve the separation of church and state.
It's an uphill battle right now. I'm sorry. It's an uphill battle because the Supreme Court is allied against us. This is, I think, the most dangerous Supreme Court since the Roger Taney Court with the Dred Scott decision. Certainly on issues of the First Amendment, separation of church and state, they have no regard whatsoever for the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So we're up against pretty tough odds in trying to redress that. But just take that issue for itself, the 10 Commandments in public school classrooms. I don't have any particular objections to that. 10 Commandments, I mean, there's nothing to criticize really about the 10 Commandments, although I think we have a president who's violated most of them. But I mean, if these people are really serious about making a Christian nation, 10 Commandments is probably not the place to start. I'd probably go to the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. Let's start there. Or how about Matthew 25, when Jesus told his followers to care for the least of these, to welcome the foreigner as one of your own. If we're talking about Christian nationalism, that's where I'd start if I were a Christian nationalist. But again, it's a fetishization, I think, of the 10 Commandments. And again, there's nothing objectionable about the 10 Commandments themselves, but is that really going to be the focus of your efforts to reform society or whatever it might be? And it's an attack on public education, which I think is essential. Public education, I think, is the crown jewel of American public life. I'm a product of public education myself. Friggin' I'm a proud product of public schools, and if you look back into the 19th century and the origins of the common school movement, what we call public schools today, they were very much supported by people of faith because they recognized that this was the way to try to bring about some measure of equality in society, particularly for the children of those who are less fortunate. This was a way for them to toe the ladder of upward mobility and to become more prosperous, move into the middle class, to put it in class terms. And I believe that if we are serious about democracy In the future of democracy, we have to be serious about protecting public education. Public schools are the one place in our society where children of different racial backgrounds, religious convictions, even socioeconomic backgrounds can come together in the classroom, on the playground, explore their differences, celebrate their similarities, and most important, learn how to get along with one another. That to me sounds like a recipe for democracy. And if we give up on public education, I think we're giving up on democracy. Now, I realize what I've just described is an idealistic understanding what public schools are, and public schools have probably rarely met that kind of idealistic standards, but I don't think we can afford to give up on that quest.
Would you say that's America's second best idea?
I don't want to get into that.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I have to think
Go
about that. No.
Are you familiar with Matthew Taylor's book about the NAR, that's the New Apostolic Movement, the Seven Mountains Mandate, and the Dominionists in the United States and around the world? Can you speak to their evolution and their influence on the present Trump administration?
It's actually the New Apostolic Reformation movement. It's you didn't read it wrong. It was
Yikes.
mistaken there. This is a kind of Christian nationalism on steroids sort of movement. There are various people, probably the person most associated with it is a guy by the name of Lance Wallnau, W-A-L-L-N-A-W, and he's been very prominent in evangelical circles. The Seven Mountains thing is, they see it as a mandate for Christians, and I have to point out they define the term Christian quite narrowly to be evangelical Christian, white evangelical Christian. Mandate for Christians to dominate 7 mountains in our society, and I won't be able to name them all, but I'll try. Education, family, government, entertainment, I've done pretty well 4, 3 more. Economics, I think, but in a sense they're trying to take over everything. So it's Christian nationalism, as I said, on steroids is what this movement is.
And the Trump administration is?
Yeah, people like Paula White Cain would be in that camp. This is Trump's principal spiritual advisor, apparently.
He has one?
She's in that camp as well, but others as well.
Okay. Could you comment on churches retaining tax-exempt status while promoting candidates?
Yeah, this goes back to the Johnson Amendment in 1954. What happened with Lyndon Johnson, who, of course, was extraordinary individual. Bill Moyers, his assistant, who just passed away, sadly, Bill Moyers once said that Lyndon Johnson was 13 of the most fascinating people he'd ever met. But Lyndon Johnson was facing re-election in Texas to the Senate in 1954, and there were a group of very wealthy individuals who were trying to derail his re-election. And they were doing so through tax-exempt organizations, funneling their money into tax-exempt organizations. So Lyndon Johnson introduced the so-called Johnson Amendment to the Congress, which passed in 1954, which forbade nonprofit organizations from making political endorsements and political preferences made
and contributions.
Contributions, yeah. So, and that has been on the books since 1954, and it's become a target for these Christian nationalists because they want to be able to funnel money through their churches in order to support political candidates explicitly. I think it's a dangerous proposition. First of all, it's a money laundering scheme, essentially, because if you want to support a political candidate, why not get a tax deduction for doing so? That'd be a pretty good way to do it. It turns these churches into money laundering operations. But again, it just blurs this line of separation between church and state. And the Trump administration has been trying, both in the first term and now in the second term, to undermine the First Amendment. The IRS recently issued a ruling saying that churches can make political endorsements. I don't think it has the force, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think it has the force of law, because the Johnson Amendment was passed by Congress and signed by Dwight Eisenhower, by the way. It was passed by Congress, and it seems to me that to really reverse it, you would need an act of Congress to reverse it. Not to say that this Congress isn't capable of doing it. I expect they probably are, but they have not done that yet. But I think the Johnson Amendment is awfully important in maintaining this wall of separation between church and state.
Yeah, undoing it seems like allowing the wilderness to enter the garden.
Sure, absolutely, exactly, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
As you might, you won't be surprised, we had a lot of questions about Christian nationalism and what's up there. So to synthesize that, one question is, what do you believe to be the end game of Christian nationalists? And also related, what is driving this attempt to reunite the church and government?
Well, I think in many ways the Seven Mountains Mandate is probably the pipe dream, that is to take over everything. Everything from education to entertainment. I don't know if I mentioned education in part of my earlier listing, but education would be a big part of their aspiration. And I guess make this into a Christian empire of some sort. I have to, we talk about Christian nationalism, I have no problem identifying the nationalism part of it. I have a good bit of problem identifying what's Christian about it, frankly. But they have their ideas about what is Christian. And I mentioned earlier in the lecture, no abortion, no same-sex marriage, no divorce, and that sort of thing. And in many ways, those are some the foundation points. And then they want to go further and I suppose eventually to dictate curricula at not only public schools, but Dartmouth College for that. I mean, they may want to come into my classroom and say, you're not being hard enough on Muslims or something. I don't know what they want, but none of it looks good to me from here, I have to say.
Right. Let's see. Related to the questions about Christian nationalism are questions about, so what can we do about this in terms of resisting these kinds of movements, especially given the fact, I won't say fact, but the observation that the Christian right seems to be very well organized and those who oppose them are not so organized.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, the headwinds are pretty strong these days, I think, especially with the Supreme Court. That worries me. I mean, it has for years. The Supreme Court has worried me more, I think, more than anything in terms of where we're heading on that particular issue. There are a number of organizations that seek to thwart that sort of movement in that direction. Americans United for the Separation of Church and State is a very good organization that's trying to do that sort of thing. There's also the Baptist Joint Committee, and this probably merits some comment. I made a point about saying that Roger Williams was the founder of the Baptist tradition in America, as he certainly was. And up until 1979, Baptists, by and large, were pretty faithful watchmen on that wall of separation between church and state. And with the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention in June of 1979, that changed rather dramatically. And now you have the Southern Baptist Convention that is supporting school vouchers and all sorts of stuff that really undermines that separation between church and state. So Baptists as a whole, we can no longer rely on to monitor that wall of separation, which means others have to do that. And I enlist in that enterprise myself. So the Baptist Joint Committee was previously sponsored by the Southern Baptist Convention when it was serious about monitoring this wall of separation. And when the conservatives took over the Southern Baptist Convention, they kicked out the Baptist Joint Committee and formed another committee that is really trying to undermine separation of church and state. So those organizations, I think, are important, trying to stanch the movement in that direction. And I don't dismiss the importance of aggregate individual acts of defiance and resistance. I think it's very important. The No Kings rally a couple of weeks ago, I think, was very, very important. And the turnout exceeded all expectations as far as I know. People lining up on the Lyman Bridge, for example, and saying, this is not acceptable. We're not going to let this pass silently. Now, what changes has it wrought so far? Probably not much. And I think we probably can't expect much, at least before the midterm elections next year. I think the Republican domination of Congress and certainly the Supreme Court as well as the executive means there's no guardrails on the Trump presidency. And the Supreme Court aptly named Trump v. United States decision really suggested that all bets are off in terms of...
Was that the immunity decision?
I'm sorry?
Was that the immunity decision?
No, yeah, Trump's immunity. Yeah, Trump can do whatever he wants as president, essentially is what it said. So right now we're operating in a world with no guardrails, and I think that's a very dangerous place to be. So we have to resist, vote. As they used to say in Chicago, vote early and often. I mean, I shouldn't say that, I don't mean that, but voting, I think, is very important.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
Yeah,
no.
And I think each of us brings his or her own gifts to this resistance movement. I'm happy to stand out there on Lyman Bridge or nearby to protest, and I did. But I'm a writer, so I try to do some of my resistance in writing, and other people have other avenues to express themselves, and I think it's important to exploit all of them to do that. I think it's necessary in a crucial moment like this.
Absolutely. And on that note...
Run for office.
Yeah. There is this organization, Run for Something, that gives people a lot of support if they decide they want to run for office, and it could be the school board.
Yes.
I mean, it's very ecumenical that way. One quick, it's not a quick response, but let's close with, when politicians and others tout their Christian values, I'm never sure what they mean or are referring to. Yeah. Can you clarify? It seems many of their actions are opposed to Christian values.
I agree. No, I've spent far too many years of my life trying to call I grew up in evangelical, and I still, in many ways, have affinities with that movement. And what I've tried to do is to call evangelicals back to their better selves and say, look, if you profess to take the Bible very seriously, you've got to take Matthew 25 seriously. Jesus' command to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, visit prisoners, care for the least of these. I mean, Jesus is quite explicit about that. Jesus says in that passage, that's the ticket to the kingdom of heaven. I mean, he's pretty explicit about that. But also to call them back to their own best traditions. Now, what many people don't realize about evangelicalism is that in the 19th century and even into the early part of the 20th century, evangelicals would be considered progressive, even liberal by today's standards on the political spectrum. That is to say, not all of them, but many, and even a majority. Evangelicals were very active in the anti-slavery movement. They were active in prison reform. They were active in the formation of public education, common schools, which I mentioned earlier. Many of the early superintendents in various states, the head of public education, were clergy because, again, they recognized that this was a way to try to live out the mandates of the teachings of Jesus. They believed in women's equality, including the right to vote long before the 18th Amendment. These are all characteristics of evangelicalism, particularly in the antebellum period. And what I've tried to argue is say, look at your own past. What is the best of your own tradition? Let's try to reclaim that. And you can see how overwhelmingly successful I've been in making that argument. But I continue to make that argument.
Well, that's a wonderful place to end, recalling us to our better selves. So, and I think the evangelical movement really needs to be seen as something much broader than what it is today. So, thank you very, very much, Randall. Okay, we are dismissed.
Okay.